Now, before I ever got into the ministry, there was a span of time where after high school and before going into college, I took about 3 years to kind of figure out where I was going to go with my life. And one of the jobs that I had during that time was I worked at a furniture store. Now, it was an intense, kind of stressful job, and I know some of you guys are like, really, a furniture store? But what I did is I worked the third shift. So I would start at about 11:30, and I'd get out at about 8:30. And what I would do is every day I would go into work, and there was this huge warehouse for this chain of furniture stores, and we would get our cage, which was the loving way that they referred to your truck area, and each one was literally a cage long, and there were typically about 60 or so pieces of furniture that were going to be delivered that day. And so what it was, each person in charge of the cage, which I was in charge of one, it was my job to put all of the pieces of furniture together. Now, for the most part, it's not like IKEA style where it still comes in like the log and you gotta like shave it down and, put out the measurements and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was pieces that you would have to put together. I had a nice big tool case with all different types of tools, drills, mallets, hammers, offsets, different things like that. And sometimes it was easy pieces like a couch where you just had to screw in the legs. And then other times it was like an entire bedroom set, so I would need to put together the huge towers that would go on each side of the bed and the headboard, and then you'd have to lay out the rails and make sure everything lined up and then make sure that the mattress was with it. And you had to make sure all of these pieces were in the correct order and put together. If there were pieces that were broken, you had to repair the pieces. And they all had to be done by 6 o'clock when the drivers arrived to load up their vehicle for that day's delivery. And the drivers were pretty intense because the minute it got into their vehicle, they were now responsible for it. And so they would go over it meticulously and make sure everything was good. And over time, I developed a good friendship with several of the drivers. Some of them annoyed me at first. There was one guy that, because of my skin, when my skin was really bad, to help me work with the tools and different things like that, occasionally I would have to put on a glove. And it just so happened that I had the glove on my right hand. And the first time that I worked with him, he came in, he's like, "Yo, hey, prepper. Oh, Michael Jackson." And from then on, I was called Michael Jackson. At first, it bothers me, and, he kind of gave me a hard time. But over time, I chipped away at his hard exterior, and every time he'd see me, he'd be like, "Michael Jackson." I'd be like, "Woo!" You don't need to know that information. Anyway, one of the first times that I had him, he was having a bad day, I was having a bad day, and as he was moving a couch along, the underneath tore, and there's a little fabric piece under there, and he tried to blame me, even though it was him and his men that were pushing it. And so we were going back and forth, and I was getting ticked off because it was a long day. I'd skip my lunch just to make sure that I could get everything done in time because it was a heavy-duty truckload of stuff that was being put together. And I just got ticked off. And so I went to my toolbox, and I grabbed my staple gun. And I was sitting there, and I'd used the staple gun over and over and over again. And so to get the guy to shut his mouth, I went over underneath, and I was like, "It's easy. See, this is how you fix it." And I went 1, 2, underneath, 3, 4, and I went. Do you ever have a moment where you do something and something in your brain's like, "Hey, you didn't do it right," but you can't figure out what it is? And so like I did it the last time, and then I stepped back a second, and I noticed that the fabric dropped, and I was like, "Well, that's weird. Put a staple there." And then this, I guess the best way I could describe it is a tingling kind of went over my body. And I was like, "What?" Don't know how to explain it. It's just everything. And then I noticed underneath my finger where I was standing, there were a couple of droplets of blood on the ground. I bent over to pick it up, and the minute my thumb contacted the ground, I felt a pain shoot like all the way up my arm. In my haste, working with the staple gun, and it was quite a bit more heavy duty than this one. I had gone through, and even though I'd used this over and over and over again, I was using it so casually that I was kind of angry at the guy that I put so much force into it, and instead of paying attention to where I was actually putting it, I put my thumb over it, and so I pierced through my nail, through the finger, through the nail, and had this huge staple thing. Worst part is I was so ticked, I walked over and had to grab a pair of pliers to take it out of my finger. It was one of those things that I was like, like it hurt for a little bit. The worst part was it got some blood on some furniture, and That means we couldn't deliver it. But it was one of those moments where you're just like, I've used this thing over and over and over again, and yet I guess I still forgot how powerful it was. So we're in this series, and we're talking about that awkward subject that not a whole lot of people like to talk about in general, let alone at church. But we're talking about relationships, sex, and pornography. And the truth is, we're talking about today kind of the competing view that we have as Christians based on what the world has when it comes to relationships and sex. I guess if we're honest, the one word that I would describe how the world views sex right now, I guess would be casual. I mean, let's be honest. I've worked with teenagers long enough, and I've worked with adults long enough to know people casually send inappropriate photos of themselves to whoever. Obviously, there's some type of relationship there, but they send them out. We, as we talked about last week with pornography, it is so casual just to tap, 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 and then you're at porn sites. We joke about it all the time. In fact, there is a word that we call, or a phrase, and it's called no strings attached. It's about being close to someone and intimate with someone without really having to worry about the ramifications. As a whole, our culture looks at sex as just a very casual thing. And so what do we do as Christians or as believers when we have the world saying, well, it's just a casual thing, get over it? And yet everything that God says in the Bible kind of goes counter to that. As I said before, God designed sex. He's not afraid of it. He's not upset about it. He's not like, I can't believe you want to have it. No, God designed it, but he designed it to be a good and beautiful thing in the right context. And that context is marriage. And what we've kind of done is we've kind of taken it and just made it about whoever we want, whenever we want, chasing down whatever feelings we want. So the question is, when you have these two competing points of view, what happens? How do we live that way? How do we farm through that and figure out how we are supposed to live as Christians? What does the Bible have to fully say about it? And how do we live in a world where they treat something sacred as casual? The truth is like this stapler. I was used to it. I knew how to use it. And man, I can use this thing all the time. Just boom, 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 boom. I know how to use a staple gun. I knew how to use every single tool in my chest. But the thing is I was so upset and so mad or whatever that I treated it so casually, and I forgot that it's still something that's powerful. And in the same way, just because our culture says sex and relationships are such a casual thing, doesn't mean that it's a powerful thing that we have to be careful of, because in the end, there are still people that can get hurt, both physically and emotionally, including ourselves. See, just because our culture says one thing doesn't mean that that's how we define it. We look at the one who designed it. God is the one that designed it. So today I want to challenge you. How do we continue to think and process through when the world says one thing about it and God says another? And so for that, we're going to jump into the Bible, and we're going back to one of the books that Paul wrote. Paul wrote like most of the New Testament. And in it, we're going to the book of Romans. And see, here's the interesting thing. A lot of times we read the Bible and we think like it's this holier than, everyone that they're writing it to is like, whoa. I guess that's my version of holiness or whatever. And we think that everyone's perfect and everyone's good and the whole land is just in such peace. But when Paul is writing this book to the churches in Rome, he's writing to a church that is living in a culture that is completely against what God is saying and how to live in the Bible. I'm sure they kind of had some confusion like we do when they see two different points of view, when they see what God is saying and then they see their culture living in a way that is counter everything with God. And so Paul writes them, and I love how Paul writes, because Paul doesn't like sugarcoat anything. He's not like, okay, I'm just going to spoon feed you just a little bit. Okay, now that you're used to it. See, right now we're feeding Ava like people food, I guess you can say. But what we do is we blend it up until it's like mush. And then to make sure she's not allergic to stuff, we give her just a little bit of the same vegetable for like 5 days, just to make sure that she's good with it. Paul doesn't like, okay, I'm just going to give you a little bit here. No. He like doesn't pull any punches. In fact, he says this in Romans. He says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good, pleasing, and perfect. As I said, he doesn't pull any punches. He's not like, well, maybe if you wade into the world and maybe if you listen to the culture and adopt some of the things. No, he's like, hey, if the world is saying one thing and God is saying another, you got to go with what God is saying. Don't compromise. Don't copy their behaviors. Don't copy their customs. Don't copy their patterns if it goes against God. So while in our culture, a lot of times we hear things like, well, to lose your virginity is a rite of passage. You got to do it before high school. Or you hear things like, yeah, but porn isn't a big deal. Everyone looks at it. Or if you're called closed-minded because you don't talk the talk or you don't laugh at the jokes, or you look at sex as a very important thing, a very sacred thing, because of that, you're treated as closed-minded. It doesn't mean go along with it. Paul says even if that is what the culture is saying and doing, if God is saying something else, you need to choose to live for God. If you call yourself a Christian, if I call myself a Christian, then we have to make a choice. Is God important? Is God worth it? Is God who I'm going to follow? And if that is the case, then I need to choose God over what the world is saying. I mean, the truth is, just because the world says that it's right, just because this is what's popular and certain phrases are popular, and this casual lifestyle when it comes to relationships and sex is popular now, it doesn't mean that the world is right. I mean, at one point growing up, Pluto was a planet for me. I had to memorize it along with the rest of the planets. I had to know that Pluto was that last little one. I had to memorize that sentence that to this day I still don't remember the sentence. But Pluto was a planet up until recently when it was decided it's not really a planet. It's like, what, a dwarf planet or something? Opinions, truth, facts, everything like that, it changed. At one point, the Earth was considered flat. And now it's only like a very, 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 very small percentage of people that still think it's flat. But at one point, everyone knew that the Earth was flat. And if you said anything else against that, you were considered a crazy person. Culture said it was flat. The world said it was flat. So it was flat until, oops, we got it wrong. At one point, you just going over and turning on a light, me having these lights overhead and over here, by just a switch would have been considered witchcraft. Electricity? What? And now it's an everyday thing. See, the world often gets it wrong. The world often changes its position. Culture changes at a rapid rate. Just because the world says something is right doesn't mean that it's always right. So instead, we have to choose, instead of aiming to live for this world and to live for culture, we have to aim at living and focus at living for God and the way God says. In essence, to treat others and ourselves differently than what the world expects. And really, how should we treat others? How should we treat ourselves? What should it look like to live differently than the world? He says this in Romans 12, 9 and 10, just a couple of verses later. Don't just pretend to love others. Really love them. Hate what is wrong. Hold tightly to what is good. Love each other with a genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. See, going back to that top verse, it says, don't copy the behaviors, the customs, the patterns of this world, but instead allow God to change the way that we think. See, the more that we align ourselves with God, the more we go after God, the more we seek after him, the more we start to look like what that verse says. Not just pretending to love others, not just pretending to love ourselves, but truly caring about the well-being and the help of others. Honestly, if you look at what is going on in the world right now, you look at some of the things that we have dealt with over the last year, one of the biggest things that is missing, one of the biggest things that has changed in the way that people view others is we don't see other people really as human. We subcategorize them. We make it like they're not really human, they're not really people. The truth is we have lost a love for each other. And no amount of government programs, no president, no big changes to the world is going to change our love for each other until we get back to this. Because see, Paul, all of these centuries ago, wrote, this is what it means to follow God. The more you follow him, you don't just pretend to love others, but you really start to love them. You start to look at what is wrong and hate it and say, no, that's not right. You shouldn't be treated that way. This shouldn't be happening. To take a stand for the right things, but it only happens when we start aligning ourselves with God. The world doesn't provide that. So why are we listening to what the world says about sex and relationships when the truth is the world just kind of drives everything further and further into the ditch? We need to really care for and honor them. And even when we look at relationships, as I said the first week, we have to ask those questions. Is this best for me? Is this best for them? And the truth is, if it doesn't fall within marriage, then it's not. But when we start viewing people through God's lens of love, we start treating them different and we start treating them better. And the truth is, as I've said over and over in this series, if you feel like I'm putting shame on you or dragging you through the mud because maybe you've made mistakes when it comes to sex and relationships, the truth is we have all made different mistakes in different categories of things. There is no shame. There is no attack. There's no hatred here. The truth is God forgives each and every one of us, but we have to start making those changes. So today I want to challenge you with doing what Paul said by allowing God to change the way that we think. And how do we change the way that we think? It starts with two simple yet hard things. To change the way that we think and how we process what this world says versus what God says, when we feel those temptations and the pull to what the world is saying and doing, and we know that it's not what we should be doing as a Christian. The first thing you have to do is you have to identify the bad patterns. Do you have certain temptations that come out to go along with and do what others are saying and doing? What are some of those bad patterns? Are there bad patterns in how the world is influencing you? Are there bad patterns in the things that you're viewing, the things that you're looking at? Are there bad patterns in how you view people? Maybe you've started to see them as a commodity or as a piece of meat. You see them as less than human. Or maybe the pattern that you need to change is the way that you view yourself. For some of us, we degrade ourselves, and then for others, it is all about me, and what I want, and what I want, and what I want. We have to start by identifying what those things are. What are those patterns that I keep on falling into? What are those patterns that are pulling me in? You can't start on this process to allow God to help change and reshape and transform your mind and yourself if we don't identify those areas where we kind of fall short, or we are pulled by temptation. And then the second thing is to renew your mind. Renew basically means to like make it new again. To take something that sometimes has messed up, sometimes has gotten gunky. It's kind of like Arya has this toy that was outside for a while, and when she got it, it was brand new. But over time, I got dirt, and I got crud, and I got gum, and I got all this kind of stuff just from sitting outside, ash from the fires, all that stuff. And so one of the days, me and Melissa took it, and we wiped it down. We cleaned it. We made sure that this thing was sparkly clean. We took off all of that bad gunk, and to Arya, it looked brand new again. We need to allow God to do that with our minds. For me, as I talked about last week, I struggled with porn for several years as a teenager. And one of the things I had to pray about when I got out of it was, God, I pray that you would give me that kind of innocent mind again. Because after viewing so much stuff, it kind of transforms, as I said, chemically and emotionally. It changes the way that you view things. And so I had to pray, God, renew my mind. Break these old habits. Break these old thought patterns. We have to change our behavior. That is how we start with a new mind. I know you're like, but a behavior, how is that going to change my mind? But it's not until you start these things and to start making them a habit. And then when we make them a habit, that is when we start to see God really reflecting in our minds. We have to change the behaviors. So for me, one of the biggest things when I was struggling with porn, for me at the time, the easiest thing was the family computer in the living room when everyone went to bed. And so I looked up a verse, had the verse printed out, and taped it to my computer screen. The very top. Just to make sure that every time I went there, I had that verse staring back at me. So before I would start to look at anything, I would see that verse right there. And it was a verse that would challenge, and it was a verse that would remind me that I can't fall into these things. It said, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. The evil deeds of faithless men I will hate. They will not cling to me. So every time I would go onto the computer, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. Okay, I shouldn't be looking at that. I also had to make a habit. Okay, I'm only going to be on the computer when others are around. Because it's a lot harder to look at that stuff when others can see it right there. But I had to start changing and making that a pattern, a behavior. Maybe if you see people as objects and you've lost all value for a lot of humans, unfortunately for guys sometimes this becomes easier in how we look at girls, then I challenge you with this. Maybe the new habit, the new behavior that you have to make is to go out of your way to honor and help those that you once treated like objects. Do you find that your attitudes or thoughts change with the people that you hang out with? Maybe you know that there are a certain group of friends that sometimes lead you to that temptation, or you just change completely and you're like, wow, what did I become? Who am I? Maybe you need to start setting limits on how often you hang out with those people. Maybe it's a habit you built in secret. See, the secret things are the hardest things because they grow and flourish the more quieter we are, the more we do those things in the darkness when no one else knows, because you don't really have to pay a price for it. Maybe the new habit is saying, I'm going to find that person that I trust, that I know I can be held accountable to, and share that secret. See, these things are hard, these things can be awkward, but the truth is, it's not until we start setting these new patterns, looking at what is causing us to fall into this, what is causing us to look at the world and want those things of the world, what are our weaknesses, and then creating new habits to strengthen those things that once made us weak. See, I say these things not to embarrass you, and again, not to put shame or judgment or anything like that, but I say these things because I care about each and every one of you. I know, whether you believe it or not, that God has a plan for your life and He's going to do great and amazing things through you, but I don't want to see you fall into these traps and into these temptations and never find your way out. I want to see and be a part of all that God has for you. So it starts with identifying, in essence, those weaknesses. And then creating those new habits by renewing our mind. So God, we come before you and I thank you for each and every student that is within the sound of my voice. I thank you for them and I pray that you would bless them. If anyone is struggling with this temptation, if anyone is just confused on why they're pulled so much to what the world is saying and the world treats it as casual and yet you treat it as sacred, I pray that we would choose to live for you and not always believe the lies and the traps of the world, but that we would live differently, and through that living differently, we would shower your love on others. Pray that you would help us, give us strength, help us to identify those bad behaviors and to allow you to renew our mind through new habits. We thank you and praise you in your name. Amen. All right, as always, guys, we have a lot of stuff that is going on campus, trying to keep you guys up to date for those that are off campus. March 5th, there's not going to be a video or anything because we're doing an on-campus worship experience. So if you guys want to, come on out. It'll be a great thing. We'll actually be in the main auditorium building, so there'll be a lot more space and all that kind of stuff for that special worship experience. We're working on summer camps, hopefully, God willing. We're working on lots of stuff, another drive-in movie and different things like that to keep us busy, active. Make sure if you guys need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Instagram, on Facebook, a text, a call. I am really that close to you. All right. Love you guys. Miss you. Can't wait to see you soon.